All right, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's well rested after their 2 weeks off. We're going to get straight back into it. I'm going to give you a bit of feedback on the questions that I set for you last week. In particular, we're going to look at this 8-mark question: explain the significance of the slave trade for Britain. Now, 8-mark question, nice and straightforward. All we need to do is write 2 paragraphs. The key part of this question is your explanation of what makes your point significant. So therefore, the key explaining word we're looking for is because. So we're not just looking for facts, we're looking for you to explain why that point is significant. So if your point is to do with the money made, you need to explain what that money was used for or why it was so important to get more money. And we're going to go through that. Now. So let's start with the key facts to include. So if I was given this question in an exam, these are the things that I could include in an answer about the significance of the slave trade for Britain. I might say that it replaced indentured servitude and it made the system more efficient. We know that indentured servitude was not working, and the use of slaves was seen as a lot more efficient for British slave owners and plantation owners, mainly because of things like you don't have to pay them, they have no rights, and again there's a lot of other arguments that you could include there. Another key factor I might include was that profit can be made at all corners of the slave triangle, whether it's merchants unloading the ships in British docks, whether it's them transporting goods and trading goods in West Africa for slaves, whether it's selling those slaves in the Caribbean, whether it's the plantation owners who have bought those slaves who are then putting them to work and then transporting their goods back to Britain. At every single stage of this triangle, huge amounts of profit is being made. And that profit leads people to invest, and there are huge amounts of investors from London, including royalty. For example, King Charles was a partner in the Royal African Company, and that company was responsible for transporting 60,000 slaves from, in an 8-year period between 1680 and 1688. A really good key fact that you could include there. It is also important that the slave trade provided a large number of jobs like shipbuilders, ship owners, bankers, investors, dock workers, importers, industrial factory workers. So for those workers in factories in London, the cotton that was arriving from the plantations could then be turned into textiles, okay? And those textiles then be sold somewhere else. British slave industry made approximately £60 million between 1761 and 1808, and that made Britain the richest country in the world. Being the richest country in the world meant you're also the most powerful country in the world. So it's not just about the money, but it's also about status and what that gives Britain. The last fact that you could include is large cities like Liverpool and Bristol grew as a result of the slave trade, and they were seen to be built on the profits of that industry. So those are the facts that we could include, and there are a few others if you came up with some others, but these, in my opinion, are the easiest to explain in a sentence. We're going to look at 2 answers. So let's look at the first one. The slave trade was significant because it helped Britain make a lot of money. 3 million slaves were transported to the Caribbean islands. These slaves ended up working on plantations such as tobacco, which helped Britain generate £250,000 per year. This money was usually invested back into Britain to help them develop. The slave trade was also significant because many new buildings were made, such as the National Portrait Gallery in London, on the proceeds of slavery. So this answer is good because it's specific. It mentions tobacco as a crop, it mentions the Caribbean islands, it mentions the number of slaves, although that's not completely accurate. And it mentions a number figure suggesting that they're making huge amounts of money. So not only are they making the point, they're also backing it with evidence. The issue with that first paragraph, though, is in the highlighted section here. Instead of going back to their argument and arguing it further, they've just written the slave trade was also significant. So when you say also significant, that's adding a separate point. So really, this sentence has actually distracted the examiner from the point you're making here. Instead, this should be, this is significant because, and it should develop this idea more about investing money back. And that could actually support the point. But unfortunately, the way it's been written is as a secondary point, and therefore you kind of lose a lot of momentum in your answer. The slave trade was significant because it helped boost Britain's status across the world. This is because Sir John Hawkins was the first trader to use the slave triangle and to come up with this system. Since he was the first, that meant that many people would copy soon after. This led to the boost in Britain's status. Again, a valid point, but your supporting evidence isn't really linked to that point. You've reasserted yourself at the bottom, but you haven't actually said how Sir John Hawkins increases the status, whether it's to do with money, whether it's to do with global positioning, whether it's to do with how it's beating other countries in that part of the world. It's just a bit too loose. This is bolted on at the end, and you haven't actually explained your point fully. So, a good answer, but it's unable to get into the top half of those marks. So this would be capped at 4 because you haven't actually explained and linked back to the question enough. Let's have a look at the last one. The slave trade was significant for Britain because it helped Britain to expand their market and be able to import raw, expensive materials into Britain. Yes, it did. That's an excellent point. I know this because materials like cotton were being produced on plantations by slaves, and products being made were being exported back to Britain. So I've highlighted that just because the materials like cotton were being sent back in their raw form, and then they were being sent to British textile factories to create goods and then be sold. So those things aren't being created on the plantation. So we've kind of skipped a step with that. But the point is still good. This is important because these products would either be sold in Britain or sold to other countries through trading deals. The only thing missing on this last sentence is the profit generated. If you continue to make a point about the amount of money being created for Britain, that would be a much better point. So that last link back to the question, you've got evidence in there. You've talked about cotton. You've talked about cotton. You've talked about raw, expensive materials. It just needs to be a bit more specific with its link back at the end. Last paragraph, the slave trade was also significant as Britain controlled many countries in west of Africa. I know this because slaves were normally captured in the west of Africa, then transported to either the Caribbean or America. This was called the triangular trade. This is important as Britain made millions of pounds through the selling of slaves, as well as raw materials found in Africa, like ivory and gold. Again, so the raw materials made in Africa is later. At the moment, Britain is solely focused on removing slaves. Again, this point is a little bit too generic. It's good. It just needs, you really need to zoom in on the fact you're talking about, the fact that money is being made at all corners of the triangle. Yes, it makes millions of pounds through selling slaves, and that needs to be linked to Britain, the fact that means Britain is more wealthy, it means Britain has more status. So again, another good answer, maybe creeps into the 5, probably not a 6, just because that last paragraph needs to be more focused. So that's going to be it for today. Just 2 questions gone through. Please keep working. Please keep doing week 3. There's more to come. And stay safe this week. All right. Thank you very much. Goodbye.